Hello, Helga. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I hear you fine.
Great. You're loud and clear. And so welcome to Australia via cyberspace. And just by way of introduction, Helga is the chairman of the International Schiller Institute. And just recently, a number of us had the privilege of going to Germany and participating in the last conference, which was a series of conferences. So Helga has graciously allowed her time to address our conference and update us on the extremely important breaking developments that are happening in the world today. The other theme of our conference, of course, the main theme of our conference is the work of Nicholas of Cusa, as you've seen from the written material that we've sent out to everyone. And Helga is a scholar in Nicholas of Cusa, someone who's brought Nicholas of Cusa to life, literally, throughout the world in the last, many, many years. So without any further introduction, I'd like to welcome Helga to our conference. And after you've given an address, we've invited people to come forward and ask as many questions as they can. So welcome to Australia.
Well, I'm obviously very happy to greet you for your 25th anniversary national conference, especially naturally on a day like today, because as you know, we had the extremely happy occasion that a major step towards saving civilization from the brink of the abyss was taken yesterday when the Senator Tom Harkin introduced in the United States the GlassSteagall Act, and exactly in the tradition of the GlassSteagall Act of 1933 and Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, the same bill, almost word by word, had previously been introduced in the Congress, the so-called Captor-Jones bill, which by now has 62 co-sponsors. Now, the fact that now the Senate has almost the same exact bill means that the global fight for GlassSteagall has really gotten into a winning proposition. Now, the same day, yesterday, it was the 20th state of 50 states of the United States which introduced a resolution for GlassSteagall, urging their congressional delegation to support GlassSteagall. Now, also yesterday, the Regional Council of Tuscany, the region in Italy, introduced a similar resolution, which makes me also very happy because it's a sign that Europe, despite all of its troubles, is not dead, but is alive and fighting. And the fact that there was this identical bill in both houses of the US Congress means that this is now a very serious proposition, because in the United States it's generally understood that if you have a bill in both houses, then it's not just a bill, but it is a serious proposal to actually be voted on and enacted on. Now, obviously, this does not yet mean that we have won the fight, but it means the war can be won. I mean, it's a completely different universe from the day before yesterday and yesterday. And I can say very, very proudly that the absolute lion's share for this policy to come that far is going to our international movement, because the name GlassSteagall, for example, 2-3 years ago in Europe was completely unknown. The notion of separation of the banks was equally unknown. And now very serious forces around the globe, in Europe, in the United States, in Asia, and obviously also in Australia, are really fighting very hard to get GlassSteagall implemented. Now, I can report to you from those who did the work in the Congress and the state legislators that there is right now a completely changed, much more serious mood among those who are voting for it or giving their name to it, because they know this is not just some banking reform curbing high-risk speculation, but this is the first step to the absolute necessary going back to the American system of economy in the tradition of Alexander Hamilton. Now, obviously, American system of economy means not just credit system, it means the principles of the American Constitution, the absolute sacredness of national sovereignty. It means the idea of the common good, not only for this generation, but for generations to come, are being upheld again. Now, this is a major, major step in the direction for the survival of civilization. Because most of you know that my husband, Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, has said very many times in the recent years that without GlassSteagall, there is absolutely no chance that mankind is able to escape the danger of its extinction. Now, this breakthrough in the US Senate is only the first moment, but it comes not one moment too early, because the world right now is hanging on the edge of a total blowout of the global financial system, which immediately would mean a plunge into global chaos and a dark age. And absolutely related to this blowout, pending blowout of the financial system, we are still, as we are talking here to each other, on the verge of thermonuclear war. Now, the present global financial crisis obviously didn't start yesterday, but it is the end result of the paradigm shift which occurred 40 to 50 years ago. The shift away from production, away from science and technology, towards fast money, money makes money on the markets, to the idea of high-risk speculation. But this present paradigm shift was obviously escalated with the repeal of GlassSteagall in 1999. So the present condition of the world is therefore the result of the efforts to undermine, of the British Empire to undermine the idea of national sovereignty, the legacy of Franklin D. Roosevelt, and so forth. And when I say British Empire, I do not only mean the nominal British influence through the Commonwealths, which you in Australia are obviously extremely painful aware of, but I mean that power of globalization which has emerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The conglomerate of independent or not so independent central banks, investment banks, hedge funds, insurance companies, private equity funds, locusts of all kinds, and basically the idea of the world empire, which was really created after the collapse of the Soviet Union by Margaret Thatcher and Bush Sr., whereby they had the idea to create an Anglo-American empire based on the Anglo-American special relationship, and have proceeded ever since to eliminate any obstacle to this empire. And the means by which they proceeded were rather nasty. They had the idea of regime change against any country which would not submit by free will. They were pursuing the so-called colored revolutions against many countries of the former Comecon and Soviet bloc. They were working, as it now is coming out in tremendous scandals, with terrorist rebels in order to overthrow legitimate governments around the world. And they are finally targeting those two countries which naturally have to be absorbed if the empire is to be completed, and that is Russia and China. And they are doing so at the risk of a thermonuclear war. Now, the financial side, which went along with this building of the empire, was on the one side based on the greed for money and power of a significant minority of the oligarchy. But there were two factors involved. One is, naturally a depraved financial oligarchy, which has no other interest than the maximization of their personal profit at the expense, literally, of the happiness of billions of people, at the life of many millions of people already. But there is this second factor, and that is an oligarchy centered on the British monarchy, which indeed wants to reduce the world population from 7 to 1 billion people. And that has been explicitly stated by such creatures like Prince Philip. Now, we are on the edge of a blowout of this system, and that makes the present situation so extremely dangerous. The CEO of the largest asset management firm of the world, PIMCO, Bill Gross, basically said recently that the entire world financial system is nothing but a gigantic Ponzi scheme, a chain letter, which eventually will blow up. And this chain letter is about to disintegrate in a supernova. I mean, this phenomena when stars die. And a German economic newsletter commented this PIMCO statement by saying that the aggressive light, which goes along with the dying of the supernova, is at the point of its extinction, is practically the same thing like the irrational exuberance which you can see in the stock markets right now, where all the bourses go up wildly to record heights, all based on hot air and virtual money. And what Bill Gross then basically said, that after the supernova explosion occurs, after that there is nothing. Now, it happens to be that this nothing in the real world means a lot of dead people. It means billions of people scheduled to die. Now, if you look at the transatlantic region, it's hopelessly bankrupt. The Eurozone is at a point of disintegration and total crisis. And right now, you have the end phase of something which happened after 89 into 92, namely that the euro, this completely artificial currency, which is absolutely not based on an optimal currency zone, but which unites countries which are completely different. You have highly industrialized countries like Germany, you have agrarian states like Greece or Portugal, and they could never work. So the euro from the beginning was not intended to make Europe strong, in light of or in front of the emerging powers of the BRIC, for example, but it was from the beginning meant to destroy Europe on behalf of the British Empire. Now, the euro was imposed supposedly as the price for German unification. And the EU, from that moment on, the latest, became what the British Empire wanted, namely the regional European expression of the British Empire. And that was stated explicitly in one article some years ago by Ambrose Evans Pritchard from the Daily Telegraph, who basically admitted that the Brussels policy is the perfect carrying out of what London's policy is. And the advisor of Lady Ashton, Robert Cooper, said shamelessly that the European Union is the largest imperial extension in history. Now, this was not meant to become a strong continent, but it was meant to return Europe into a feudal condition. Now, Jacques Attali, the advisor of Mitterrand, who was one of the culprits in the creation of the euro, basically admitted that the euro was created deliberately with a birth defect, that it was clear that a monetary union would not be possible without a political union, and that sooner or later it would come to an existential crisis of the euro, and then that crisis could be used to enforce the political union. And that is exactly at the point where we are now. Now, the euro and the EU are at the point of collapse. And they are the people of Europe and the institutions are threatened with the gun to their head. Either you accept a full-fledged EU dictatorship, or the EU and the euro will collapse and disintegrate in a chaotic way. Now, you have a situation where the so-called permanent bailout mechanism, the ESM, presently has only 700 billion euro, which in light of what is at stake are the proverbial peanuts. So therefore, there is now a big push to establish a banking union and a collectivization of the debt, which naturally the Germans should pay, because Germany is the only major country in Europe which still has a net surplus. So as a result of the continuous bailout policies since actually 2008, the European bank debt is now at a whopping 9.3 trillion euro, and the state debt is at 3.4 trillion euro. That means there is an immediate money requirement of 12.7 trillion euro as compared to the meager 700 billion in the ESM. So therefore, what they are now coming up with is the so-called Cyprus template, which we saw when basically the Cyprus parliament had rejected the draconian cuts. It became clear that they really want to have an expropriation of the deposits of the depositors in the both savings banks and business accounts, even under 100,000. The parliament rejected it and they said, okay, only above 100,000. But that is really just a preliminary step because when Merkel, after the explosion of the financial crisis after Lehman Brothers, had promised state guarantee for every asset in the banks up to 100,000, now it becomes clear that this is obviously not enough. And recently, Focus magazine admitted that if it comes to a crisis, then every asset in the bank, savings bank, business account, giro account, from €1 upward is really a target. And even that is not enough. If you take all the permanent bailout mechanism, permanent all the savings and assets, this is not enough. So therefore, what you can read in the European press right now is that the debt is so big that for generations to come, Europe is supposed to groan under the debt burden. And they say the road to slavery is opened. Now, if you look at what this empire is doing to Europe, the central banks all over the world, the Bank of England, the EZB, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of Japan, they are going for quantitative easing, which means hyperinflation, just printing as much money as you need, but in combination with brutal austerity and the bail-in, which means access to the assets in the banks. Now, this is the expropriation of the life savings of people in the most brutal form, and it means in practice genocide. In Southern Europe, it is absolutely clear that what is happening is genocide. The UN representative for human rights denounced the policy of the Troika as a severe human rights violation. The former presidential candidate of the Socialist Party in Portugal, Manuel Alegre, recently gave a very shocking interview where he said that we in Europe are already all living in a concentration camp, that it would be a complete illusion for some to think that it will not hit them just because some others are already marched away to die, because if they don't act now, then this will be the fate of all of us. Now, there is a new book out in the United States by David Stuckler and Sanjay Basu, How Austerity Kills. And it is a quite useful discussion, not new, but it just confirms what we have said many, many times, that there is a direct correlation between unemployment and suicides. That politicians have little regard for the human cost of their decisions. That the fiscal policy is a matter of life and death. For example, in Greece, the health budget was cut by 40% since 2008 by the Troika. 35,000 doctors and nurses have lost their job. Infant mortality has gone up by 40%. Malaria returned. Cancer patients have to wait 18 months before they get operated, which some don't make it that far. Youth unemployment in Greece is now at 64.2%. In Spain and Portugal, it is above 50%. Worldwide, more than 1 billion people are either unemployed or are underdeployed. And obviously, this is the biggest cost to the world economy, and it is deliberate to shrink the real economy and to reduce the capacity for civilization. Now, the price of austerity can be calculated in numbers of human lives it costs. The monetarist austerity, which puts the profit of the banks as more important than human life, is killing people. If you add the green paradigm to that, which has the same effect, you can really see that there is a conscious effort to reduce population. For example, the speculation in food, in biofuel, the reduction of food supplies worldwide is already shrinking the world food supplies below the level needed to maintain the present people. To fill one tank with 50 liters of biofuel, you need 352 kilograms of corn, of which a child in Africa or Mexico can live 1 full year. So the person who is filling his tank once is killing a child in the third world. The 10 largest food conglomerates control 85% of all food trade worldwide, and they are culprits together with the banks in this policy. The World Bank has admitted that there are 1.2 billion people living in extreme poverty. And when the price for corn goes up by 63% in 2 years, which it just recently did, many people die because they cannot afford it anymore. Egypt, a major country in Asia and in Africa, where 50% of the people live on the poverty line or below, these people have now to spend 85% of their income for food. And naturally, the mortality rate is going up. So there is genocide all over the place, and everybody could see it. The crime which is developing in front of the eyes of the world public is so gigantic that it is an outrage why not more people are saying so when they are being murdered like in the concentration camp. Fortunately, the Pope made a very important intervention with a recent speech or article where he made a very strong condemnation of the tyranny of the present financial system, which he says has induced fear and desperation in the hearts of many people who pay with the joy of life has vanished. What has increased is indecency, violence are on the rise. And he says all of this has its origin in a very profound human crisis. It reduces men and women to consumer goods which can be used and thrown away. Now just think about the human trade of prostitutes from Asia, from Eastern Europe, or think about the trade with organs which poor people are supposed to sell to live. Or think about the absolute unworthy working conditions in places like Bangladesh, where people indeed are working for slave labor wages and under security conditions where they die by the hundreds if these buildings collapse. Now, the Pope says furthermore that the financiers presently consider God as dangerous because he calls for men to have his full realization as a human person. and is calling for independence from any kind of slavery. Therefore, the Pope appeals for a financial reform and calls upon a courageous change in attitude on part of the political leaders in the world. And I think this should be used to the widest, because not one Catholic and not one Protestant, not one Christian or not one believer in any other great religion should not listen to this appeal. Now, the change in attitude we see emerging, but it is obviously not sufficient. But there is worldwide a pre-revolutionary and in some places even a revolutionary situation developing. For example, the mood in the United States is to go back to the American system of economy, and the motion for GlassSteagall is only the first step. There is a growing targeting of Obama for impeachment. Afro-American leaders are turning away from Obama by saying that, he has created conditions worse than under Bush. Important Afro-American leaders like Cornel West accused Obama of war crimes. The Afro-Americans are turning away, but also progressive Democrats and many others. Now you have the eruption of several important scandals. The Benghazi scandal, which will eventually unearth the real reasons for the murder of Ambassador Stevens and 3 other Americans. Now, what will come out is my humble guess, is that what is really at stake in the Benghazi affair is that the policy which was started by Brzezinski in the 70s and in the 80s, namely to train radical Muslims, the Mujahideen, for the war against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, is now modified in the form of that the Anglo-American empire is working consciously with terrorist rebels in order to effect their policy of regime change, as we have seen it in Iraq, Libya, and now threatening in Syria. Now, this will come out in the hearings, I'm sure, but there are also many other scandals. The famous IRS scandal, where the administration used the IRS to target opponent groups, which naturally makes the population most upset because it is their pocket which is at stake. Then the AP scandal, which touches on the First Amendment and which has turned the entire media corps against Obama. Then still lurking, you have Fast and Furious, the scandal of the gun running to the Mexican drug mafia. Not to speak about other scandals which right now are not in the foreground, but which could come, which is the drone killing, which has killed more than 5,000 people, including collateral damage in the form of the deaths of civilians. The rule by executive order, bypassing Congress, the declaration of war without authorization of Congress, the killing of Americans and others without due process. So to sum it all up, I think Congressman Issa has done that in the best way by saying the problem with this administration is that they regard themselves as being above the law, and naturally President Obama does not feel obliged by the American Constitution, but more what he learns from the Queen, Blair, Cameron, and such people. Now, the world, in addition, is on the verge of World War III until you have a dramatic change in government in the United States. This, again, is the result of the British Empire policy. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the fall of the wall meant there was de facto no more enemy, this was a historical chance to establish a peace order for the 21st century. The LaRouche movement at that point proposed a concrete plan to unite Eurasia through the productive triangle and then through the Eurasian land bridge and later on through the world land bridge. But unfortunately, the neocons emerged in the United States, a totally Anglophile formation, declaring the new American century doctrine, which was then implemented by Bush Sr. and Thatcher, and which lasted essentially ever since, with only a certain exception in the 8 Clinton years. So what that meant for Europe was the introduction of the euro as a containment against Germany, and what it meant for the rest was that the EU and NATO went into the direction of the East extension, the encirclement of Russia, as if the Cold War was still in place. There was no reason why in 1901 one could not have asked Russia to join NATO or dissolve it, because there was no more enemy. But it went in the direction of the empire, and therefore the US ballistic missile defense system, which later was developed by Bush Jr. in Poland, in Czechia, in Spain, and recently in Turkey, was clearly aimed at eliminating the second strike capability of Russia and later of China. And this is completely understood by Russia and China that that is the intent. There was a recent study of the Strategic Studies Quarterly published by the University of the US Air Force with the title The New Economy, the New Era of Nuclear Weapons, in which they basically assert that because of recent technological innovations, it would be possible to conduct decapitating strikes against the nuclear arsenal of opponents. That because of the emergence of very precise guidance systems and new reconnaissance technologies, it would be possible to take out the nuclear weapons of an opponent without nuclear fallout. Therefore, the rules of the Cold War, that any use of nuclear weapons will lead to the mutual assured destruction of everybody, would no longer be valid, and therefore nuclear weapons could be used. Now, this article, in my view, was the most candid admission of what the present doctrine of the United States, Great Britain, and NATO is. And it is very obvious that the US ABM system in Eastern Europe is part of this, as is the deployment of Patriots to Turkey, and that behind the so-called Asian pivot policy of the Obama administration is exactly the same thing. You have pinpointed in the New Citizens very clearly that Australia is being turned into essentially a military base for an upcoming thermonuclear conflict with China, which, according to some who are thinking in the tradition of Dick Cheney, believe that the emergence of a future economic competitor in the world market has to be prevented by all means, and that therefore such a confrontation is legitimate, which, by the way, was the same reason why the Soviet Union underwent shock therapy after 1991 in order to prevent Russia from ever becoming an economic competitor on the world market. So therefore, the same process which began in the 90s in Australia, in turning Australia into basically a base for such a deployment, a period in which the European Union was turned into an empire. This all coincided with the policies of the former Deputy Defense Secretary Hugh White, who basically, a policy which was updated by Obama during his 2011 trip to Asia, where the decision and the deal was made for a permanent deployment of 2,500 US Marines in Darwin. Now, recently, that policy, which is steadily being pursued, came to the edge of a thermonuclear abyss, when Israel some weeks ago launched 2 military strikes into Syria, which was clearly an act of war, and where the danger existed that Syria could have answered by a counterstrike, at that point the danger was very acute that this would turn into a large regional war and potentially the large thermonuclear war. And only because there was a concerted intervention by the American Chief of Staff and by some others, it was stopped for the time being. From very reliable sources, we learned that what was behind this Israeli strike was their idea that a strike against Iran will take place sometimes this year, and that they wanted to get all possible allies of Iran in such an event out, by destroying weapon depots for the Hezbollah or Hamas. And it was so hot that at that point, in an unprecedented move, Carla Del Ponte declared that there were chemical weapons used in Syria, but not by the Assad government, but by the rebels. And that took completely the wind out of the sails of such people as McCain and Lindsey Graham, who had basically argued that the red line mentioned by Obama had already been crossed. So that build-up still continues. And the decision of the British to redeploy in a big way into the entire Southwest Asian region east of Suez, which was revealed by a report of the Royal United Institute, Strategic Institute, this is bringing the world at a hair trigger to a thermonuclear extinction. And the world will not be safe as long as the empire exists. And we should not let down our awareness for 1 second, because they can create pretexts as they wish. Remember the famous words of Wolfowitz after it became known that the war against Iraq was based on lies, that there were no weapons of mass destruction. Well, then Wolfowitz simply said, it doesn't matter, we use this as a pretext only anyway. So we are sitting on a powder keg. And the only way to defeat the empire is a return in the United States to the tradition of the American Revolution, for which the GlassSteagall is the first step. Now, we should be totally aware, if the US Congress implements GlassSteagall, this will mean a sudden change worldwide. If the commercial banks are put under the protection of the states, if the investment banks are left to themselves without taxpayer money bailouts, most of them will have to declare insolvency. This will have an immediate worldwide effect. Because of the cluster risk, all market segments worldwide are connected. And at that point, Europe, despite what they plan now, will have to go for GlassSteagall. And I don't mean the watered-down version which they are discussing now and which was today agreed upon by the German government, a separation of the bank proposal even less sharp than the Liikanen report proposal, which is already a joke. Now, as I said, we must not only think about a financial reform, but the world is in such a civilizational crisis which affects every aspect of life: culture, the youth, pensions, the health system, literature, poetry, just simply everything, that I believe in the very deepest corner of my heart that the world will only come out of this crisis if we go for a complete new paradigm. I'm very happy that you decided to make Nikolaus of Cusa such an important factor in your conference, because I'm convinced since a long time, actually since I found his ideas many years ago, that his ideas are the best foundation to lead the world out of this existential crisis. Now, Nikolaus was very conscious that he was writing something, especially from the Doctor Ignacia onward, something so revolutionary which had never been thought before. That he was, with his writings, beginning a new era. And if you look back what was the effect of his works, you can actually see that he was absolutely on the mark, that his writings indeed marked the difference between the dark Middle Ages and the modern times. Now, he consciously broke with scholasticism, which dominated the universities at that time, and which was the debate how many angels can sit on the top of a needle, and also the stupid mechanistic views of the peripatetics, which also was the leading ideology of the time. And he very consciously introduced a completely different method of thinking. The most famous idea of it is obviously the coincidentia oppositorum, which is the principle that the one has a higher power than the many, in a way which I will specify immediately. And naturally also the docta ignorantia. Now, also in the dialogues of the layman, in many of the sermons, he rejected very much the idea of man being able to achieve knowledge through sensuous experience. In the famous Trinity sermon of 1444, he developed the idea that the conception of the goal of the human intellect determines the road on which the mind travels to that goal. He called that the presupponit. The future defines the present. It is that which the mind and the face defines as a goal, which defines the way how you achieve it and which road you go. So the knowledge, therefore, is not a logical extension of the addition of all existing knowledge of the past, but it is what we aim at, which is already in our faith and in our intention. He arrived at a deep conception of the creation of the physical universe, which was the basis for Kepler later on to discover gravitation. He believed in the complete unity of faith and science, and that view allowed Kepler to come to his discovery in overturning Copernicus and Ptolemaios. And Cusa already had the same wonderful idea that the more you study the universe, the laws of creation, the more you become clear that this must all be the work of a tremendously loving creator. Now, Nicolaus already had the idea that the universe is totally determined by change, and that this change has an upward development. That neither the earth nor the sun is the center of the universe, and this was really the beginning of modern science. He also had the idea of concordantia in the universe and among mankind. That there is a cohesion between the laws of the macrocosm, the universe at large, and the laws of the microcosm, which is the cognitive powers of man. And that concordantia is only possible if all microcosms develop in the best possible way, and that not in a linear way, but that all unity in multitude is based on the higher principle, whereby the entire process of the totality is developing in a complicated way, like in a fugal development, whereby the development of the one is necessary to facilitate the development of the other. Now, he presumes the idea of a concordance in the universe and for mankind, based on the development principle, which must be also the basis for a better world order today. It must be the absolute sovereign nation as developing microcosms, and this is the idea of the Concordantia Catholica based on the representative system, that the government and the governed must relate to each other in a reciprocal relationship, whereby the government takes care of the best possible common good of the governed, and the representatives take care of the interest of the governed and also represent the common good of the government. Now, this is a very important idea because that conception of the representative system was really for the first time realized in the American Constitution in the full way. Now, each microcosm, therefore, only can fulfill its full potential by supporting the best possible development of the other microcosm. Now, if you apply that to politics, and that was done in the Peace of Westphalia, where the principle of the interest of the other is coming exactly from this Kusanic idea, and that was the ending of the 150 years of religious war in Europe. If you apply that to the politics today, then the best possible development of one nation must include the best possible development of all other nations. Now, what that means concretely for Australia is that Australia must have as its self-interest that China develops in the best way, Japan, all the other countries in Southeast Asia, and vice versa. Obviously, this is only possible if all of these nations are united through the common aims of mankind. Now, what are the common aims of mankind? Obviously, it means that this miserable, unworthy condition in which a majority of civilization finds itself in as a result of the policies of the empire must be overcome, that poverty must be eliminated, hunger must be eliminated, and this would be eminently possible and feasible through the realization of all the different projects of the World Land Bridge, which at the same time obviously can also be the basis for peace, for the relations with Russia, with China, with Japan, with many other countries. Now, this is only possible because the one has a higher power as the many. And mankind as a whole is a higher idea than the many different cultures and religions. This was already the basic idea of another writings of Nicolaus, which he wrote after the fall of Constantinople, the De Pace Fide, where he has 17 wise men from different nations and cultures and religions asking God for advice. And while others were talking about a clash of civilization in a pre-mature form, he had the idea that there was only one God, one truth, and one religion. And he already talked about uno religio in rituum varietate, in only one religion with different rites, which was an incredibly progressive idea for a cardinal of the 15th century. Now, obviously, the creation of the physical universe, according to Nicolaus, occurs through the creativity of man. And he even goes so far to say, and again, this was in the 15th century, that after the emergence of mankind, the continuous process of creation only occurred through the creative acts of man, which is unbelievably important. Now, he also had the notion of manu ductio, which is basically a pedagogical way of explaining how this method of development occurs. And he had basically an image like as if it would be like a metamorphosis of a plant where the mind starts with a seed and then through a multiple process of cognition is reaching the full dimension of the development of a tree with rich fruits, which gives then way to many more seeds and many more trees. Now, Nicolaus was conscious that he developed an epochal new philosophical method. And he also, in the Docta Ignorantia, especially in the second book, developed what you could call an ontology of the universe. He even said that the fulfillment of the universe is the cognition and the creativity of man, that it is the vis creativa, the power of creation expressed in man acting as imago viva Dei, as the living image of God, what drives the universe. In the Doctor Ignorantia, he says, all our great attention asserts in unity that the face is the longing of cognition, because in every faculty, in the meaning of every scientific discipline, there are made certain prepositions, the quaedam presupponum nuntur, the first principle which can only come from face and out of the insight in that which needs to be investigated, out of that the insight which needs to be invested can be gained. Now, this is a very interesting idea, because it is the idea that if science and faith are the same, and if you have a belief in what has to be part of the divine order of creation, then your mind will seek that, and you will fly with your investigation like a bird towards a goal, where the bird does it sort of instinctively, where the goal is defined, but the road is following from that. Now, if you look at that, you really find in these thoughts, the first in all of written history and literature, a discussion of how the method of hypothesis really functions, how you develop the thinking of a flank, how you create a poetical or a musical idea by having this higher idea, which is then the goal, which can then be developed. In the same way, like a great composer has a musical idea before he develops the composition. Like a poet has a poetical idea before he composes the poet. Now, this is a very important method which must be the basis of putting the political and economic order of our present world into cohesion. Now, therefore, I think in Nicolaus of Cusa, you find all the crucial ideas, all the beautiful ideas, like, for example, the proof about the immortality of the soul, which Nicolaus argues that the fact that the soul creates all the arts, the sciences, the geography, the music, and these remain forever, means that that which creates these things obviously has to have a higher power than the things created. And since the created things are immortal, the soul, the creator, has to be immortal too. Nicolaus also had the beautiful idea that man, at each point of the development of mankind, can, with scientific rigor, define what is the next necessary step of breakthrough in knowledge. Now, is that not what we know today when we say that the future of mankind has to become mankind in his identity as mankind in space? That with all the knowledge we have about the dangers from space, from asteroids, the dangers of our solar system in a couple of billion years from now, that we have to have the idea of the goal where the next scientific breakthrough has to be in order to guarantee the existence of mankind. Now, Nicolaus already had that idea in the 15th century, and I think, therefore, the more you study him, the more you become happy and enlightened. Now, if the British Empire would prevail, both financially and in the sense of military doctrine, it is very likely that mankind will be extinct and that we will prove to have not been more intelligent like the dinosaurs. But I have the fundamental similar optimism about the fact that the universe is too beautiful, the laws of creation are too powerful, that the plan of the Creator is too beautiful and strong for this to happen, if we do our job. So therefore, let's move with all powers we have to use this epochal change where we are at right now, to put the political and economic order in cohesion with the laws of the universe. If we do that, I think the future of civilization will be the brightest possible one. And I think we are in the middle of the fight. GlassSteagall is now a realistic proposition. So let's move with all our power to get the whole GlassSteagall globally and then move on to implement a renaissance.
We'd like to take some questions now, please. So if you'd like to just come down to the front, line up, and I'd ask you to introduce yourself, please, and say from where you're from inside Australia, because we have every state represented here. But I would like to add something to what Helga has just put forward as our mission. Because this conference, this 25th conference, is a celebration of the work that we've done to date. Now, 25 years ago, my wife and I and some others established this organisation specifically around the ideas at that point of national sovereignty. Now, we were greenhorns in politics. We didn't know anything about what we were doing. But it wasn't until we met Lyndon LaRouche and his ideas that this concept of imago viva Dei, that we're made in the image of God, and that we can participate in his creation, which is called Capax Day, came alive to me personally, and we established this organisation on those principles. In other words, Nicholas of Cusa, for many people who have never heard of him before, actually established our organisation 25 years ago. But today we are, and we have to have, a new revolution in our country. Because the point is, whilst we've done very good work now, as you heard from what Helga has said, we're now at the point of the potential extinction of mankind. We witness that by what's happening in Western Australia, where you see 1,200 farmers being thrown off the land out of 4,300. You see it with the destruction of the cattle industry. You see it with the destruction of the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. You see all those sorts of things are all part and parcel of the British Empire's plan. The problem is a protest movement is not good enough. There's going to be many protest movements over the next period as you come up to a federal election. What's required is a revolution in the minds of the people that we have in this room today to begin more than you ever thought was possible in order to change and direct the leadership of this country. We are the leadership of this country. So we intend to challenge you this conference through the work of Nicholas and Cusa. It's not an accident that the profound ideas that you're going to hear may make you feel a little bit unsettled. Our last conference went through the ideas of the British Empire in detail. And the single most preoccupation that the British Empire has, no matter what area you look at, is the destruction of Christianity and this idea of man created in God's image. It doesn't matter where you look, doesn't matter what you look at, it's all the same idea. So many of the ideas that have infiltrated your minds over the life of your life are most probably completely wrong. You have prejudices that you don't even know that you have based upon the brainwashing of being inside the British Empire. So that's why I say it's not an accident that we've chosen Nicholas of Cusa to be a focal point of our conference today. We will have discussions about other political policies and the extension of that, like, for example, the development of credit system for inside Australia, that we will do that. But would someone like to come and ask Helga a question?
Hi, Helga. It's Doug Mitchell. I'm one of the full-time organisers out of the national office here in Melbourne. I've had a question for a while, and it's related to the organising process and specifically organising in this period. I mean, just to let you know, we've gathered this weekend a lot of our activists who are both organising the population introducing them to GlassSteagall, because not a lot of people are familiar with the concept here. But also people were encouraging them to go and see their members of parliament and, pressure them to endorse it or introduce a private members bill for it. But the question I had, it relates to what you said about the world will not be safe as long as the British Empire exists, because in the organising and also talking to people, I hear a lot of people think, oh, it just has to get worse before people wake up, or people think there's going to be some moment down the track when the system totally explodes. But what I was thinking is, well, hang on, didn't the system crash in 2008? And since then, we've seen the whole trajectory towards this new system, as Lynn defined in that webcast back in February, where the oligarchs want to try to shift to their own, smaller system. So it's not like, we have to wait for some moment where the system's going to explode. It's already crashed, and we have to fight. We have to be the ones to establish the new paradigm, as you're saying. And I think, can you just address that in the sense of in the organising and how people should approach it?
Well, I think that we are so much on the verge of that moment which you were addressing, that if that moment comes, it's too late. Because if you look at the amount of derivative outstanding, if that shebang would come down in an uncontrolled way, triggered by another Lehman Brothers bankruptcy, you could have a chain reaction which would blow out the system exactly in this form, like the supernova image which Bill Cross from PIMCO used. The danger would be that, let's say, one of the big banks, too big to fail, would collapse, and that could happen by accident, because you have these ridiculous computer systems which speculate with the difference of nanoseconds on differences in currencies, on totally crazy things, which already led in May 2 years ago to a sudden plunge of the New York Stock Exchange of 16% in 10 minutes. And then they stopped trading to prevent a further chain reaction collapse. So we are sitting on a complete powder keg. If one of the big banks too big to fail would collapse, you could have a disorderly disintegration of the Eurozone, and you would have a sudden bankruptcy of the system. The banks would close. You would have a phenomena like what happened in Albania in 97, when these pyramid scandals collapsed, and in a matter of one day, all the banks closed. People would go to the money machine and the card would be taken in. The food stores were plundered by a starving population. The police and the army started to plunder with their families because they were hungry too. And this chaos lasted for several weeks until the Italian Carabinieri came to reestablish some kind of an order. Now, if that would happen in the entire Eurozone and in the United States, I don't want to think that. Social chaos, social upheaval would be the result. And I know that the EU, for example, is already making contingency plans for that. They have maps where they have areas where, the social riots are expected to erupt. Berlin, North Rhine-Westphalia, Rhine-Main, the suburbs in France, and so forth and so on. And, the British government has evacuation plans for the fact that the euro collapses, whereby they would transport British subjects back to the British Isle, which naturally is completely ridiculous, because once you have such an upheaval, it will really touch the city of London as much as anything else. What would happen in the United States with all these weapons people possess in their houses, I don't know, I don't want to think about it. So if this moment you are saying comes, it will be too late, because I think we would plunge into a chaotic dark age, and I cannot imagine how that would not then lead to an escalation of regional wars, which could really go into the big war. So don't wait for that moment, because if you wait for that moment, you may as well kiss civilization goodbye. I think what we have to do is we have to appeal to, the thinking 5% of the population. Fortunately, there are such people. There are other people around the world which, all belong to this 5% category. And what we are doing right now with our mobilization is to catalyze these people. Many of them are sitting somewhat privately in their laboratory, their working place, in their home, and they are, they don't think that an alternative exists, but that when we do what we are doing right now with the GlassSteagall fight in the United States, this is the second American Revolution. I mean, it's not yet won, but we are, at a very good phase in it. I mean, you should have seen the kind of mobilization what we did in the United States, where our organization plus an army of 500 activists or more have been deployed practically every week for the last several months to the Congress, to the state legislators, to the mayors, to the city councils, involving more and more groups, trade unionists, local bankers, other activists, and basically get them involved in this motion for the survival of civilization. And I'm absolutely certain that it can be done. I think right now the most optimistic fight we have in the United States. So carry that over to Australia in the same way like we are doing it in Europe, where we are basically getting people out of their cultural pessimism, which is the natural result when you are living under an empire. I mean, in Europe, if you ask somebody, we want to do this or we want to do that, 99% of the answers are, oh, one cannot do anything anyway. And then the next thing is I ask, people, what is the system you are living under when you say you can't do anything anyway? Are you then living in a democracy? Then people say, oh, maybe our democracy is in not such great shape. So the first thing is people have to become conscious that they are living in an empire. And then the next step is that you determine what is the Achilles heel of the system. And the Achilles heel of the system is that it is bankrupt. And therefore, GlassSteagall is the one absolute super weapon, which can really bring the empire down. If the United States reestablishes their American tradition, I think we can do a miracle around the world. So transmit the optimism which is right now coming from this historic fight in the United States. And I'm sure that all other parts of the empire, like Australia, like Europe, that we liberate ourselves and start to take the fate in our own hands again.
Hello everybody, I'm Callum Payne, Hyden, Western Australia. Now, when I first met Craig Isherwood, I was in a room with 18 other activists, 18 keen activists. And I look around now and see what we have here this morning. So, when you can think of how we have to change the politicians, I think the numbers here today of keen activists are proof enough that we can convince our politicians that we must change things, we can change things, and we must. Thank you.
Hi Helga, this is Jan Picullis. I'm the Queensland State Secretary for the Citizens Electoral Council, and there was some prescribed reading that everybody had to do. Not sure how many. I was on the toes of the Queenslanders And among them were some reservations, because amongst the cruiser that we were given, a giant booklet, was one of your pieces. I can't remember exactly. On the Sweetness of Truth. And there was wondering among our supporters, and they wouldn't just be from Queensland either, they'd be throughout the organisation, especially new people. They wonder, well, all this is very nice philosophy of what Helga's talking about, and it's fluffy and kind of airy-fairy, and they can't see the relevance. And I admit I had the same concerns when I first started reading the alert. On the back page of the alert every week there's something philosophical, and you think this isn't hardcore politics, and I wondered what it was all about. So perhaps you could address that for everybody.
That thought never has occurred to me. Because, I mean, look, man is not an animal. I'm very happy with the new Pope, because the new Pope is called St. Francis, and I regard myself as a Franciscan in heart. I regard the animals as my sisters and brothers, and however, despite the fact that I love animals, I must also say that man is very distinct from all other living creatures, including the animals, by the capacity of reason. And if you look at the existence of the universe, about which we know only very little actually, but in the existence of the universe, mankind only exists 7 million years at most. Of this history of mankind, only about good 3,000 years are documented in terms of writings. And that is a very short period of time. Now, if you think about it, 3,000 years, that is, I think, 200 generations. That's not much. If you look at the evolution, how man developed from barbarism, how, for example, the first time men developed the idea of a sovereign thinking individual. The first trace we have that was in the writings of Homer, in the Odyssey, where he describes the fight with the gods. The next major development was the great Greek tragedians, especially naturally Aeschylus, and the Prometheus Unbound, which is a beautiful description how Prometheus got punished by the god of Olympus, Zeus, because Prometheus had brought fire to man, and fire is an absolute synonym for technology. And in that play, or in the excerpt of this play, it is described what are the benefits of technology, how agriculture, sailing, ship traveling, all of these things improved through fire and technology. But that was the first time where man challenged his sovereignty. The next major step was Plato. Plato developed the idea of men being capable of ideas, that ideas are something which are not pragmatic deductions from sensuous experience, but that ideas are something which only the human mind can make and develop through creative hypothesis. And if you test that hypothesis and the hypothesis is adequate, it leads to an increase in human knowledge. And the process of human beings to be able to do that again and again and improve and deepen the knowledge leads man to progress. And Plato called that the hypothesis of the higher hypothesis. So then the next step clearly was what Nicolaus von Kues developed, the introduction of modern science. Then you had Kepler discovering the laws of the universe at large. Then you had Leibniz discussing the question of physical economy for the first time. And then you had the great German classical period with starting with Mendelssohn, with Lessing, then Schiller, in the music, the tradition from Bach to Beethoven. And if you look at the evolution of man in only that short period of time, as the image of man, as it was expressed, for example, in my view, in the highest form, by the German classical tradition, by such thinkers and poets like Friedrich Schiller, well, you can see that man has really developed in an unbelievable way his creative potential, his insights, his creative powers to create, that is really so undeniable. So why would not every parent have the wish to give that knowledge to their children, to contribute with their life that their children have something more to give to future generations, and in that way become immortal by connecting your fate to the limitless, hopefully limitless chain of human generations. So therefore, when you talk about the Divisione Dei, which is really a very pedagogical way of how to identify the coindentia oppositorum, which Cusa describes as this wall, which you have to jump over. You have to think beyond. You have to think outside the box. You have to think beyond that which is already existing as a body of knowledge. And the Divisione Dei is just a very nice pedagogical way of describing how you can become self-conscious about that, and why the vis creativa, the creative power, is really what makes human beings the best species at the crown of creation. So, if politics is not informed by that image of man, we will end up always with these bestial forms which we have today, where people waste their entire life to chase what? To chase pleasure in the here and now, to chase pleasure, maximum profit, to go over corpses of millions of dead people to make another profit on the stock exchange, not thinking what will be the effect of the rest of society. So if you don't want to have an oligarchical society where people are determined by greed and behave like swine at the food drug, then you have to inspire the thinking capability of human beings. And it's really like what Nicolas says, that once you have experienced the sweetness of knowledge, the sweetness of real, true human knowledge, of making discoveries about the laws of the universe, of being able to write poetry, of being able to discover physical universal principles, the joy you find out of that is so bigger than any joy you can get out of stuffing your face with caviar or some other earthly paradise pleasure. And the more you develop a taste for that sweetness of truth, the more you will become a more complete human being, like a great musician who wants to play the piano the whole day, like a great artist who wants to write poetry the whole day, like a scientist who doesn't leave his laboratory because he finds his happiness and his fulfillment in his work. So the sweetness of truth is really the greatest sweetness of all. And I wish that we come to a situation where the politicians are philosopher kings, exactly as Plato has already had the idea. And only then, if, like Nicolas of Cusa said, not only the wisest men should be the politicians and the political leaders, but also those wisest who have the biggest respect for justice and the law. And if we come to that point, then we are out of this crisis. If the majority of institutions on the planet are ruled by these ideas, I think we will go into a better phase of human evolution. So I think there is a direct connection to politics, absolutely.
Are there any more questions for Helga? Helga? We'd like to thank you very much for your address. It's given a lot of people a lot of things to think about over the course of this conference. So thank you very much for the for your time and for those very, very precious words.